Hello, my name is Jeff Whirling, and I am the Director of Macroeconomic Analysis at the Congressional Budget Office. I'm joined here today by my colleagues Gloria Chen and John Zaleski. This week, CBO released a report updating its macroeconomic projections through 2021 to account for the coronavirus pandemic. CBO's latest estimates, which are based on information that was available through May 12th, update the preliminary projections that the agency made in April. The pandemic has profoundly affected people in the United States and around the world. To slow the spread of COVID-19, many households, businesses, and governments have implemented social distancing measures, such as working from home, closing schools and businesses, and limiting social gatherings. Consequently, economic activity has been widely disrupted, causing a wave of job losses and ending the longest expansion since World War II. Between the third week of March and the first week of May, workers filed more than 30 million unemployment insurance claims. The unemployment rate surged from 3.5% in February to 14.7% in April. The employment effects have not been uniform across industries, regions, or businesses. During March and April, payroll job losses were concentrated in industries that rely on person-to-person interactions, such as leisure and hospitality, retail trade, education, and personal services. Local economies that rely heavily on tourism and hospitality have sustained some of the largest damages, and businesses that are small and young are expected to suffer a greater share of job losses. In part because the hardest hit industries employ low-wage workers, low-income families have borne the brunt of the economic crisis. Also, Black and Hispanic people constitute a disproportionate share of workers in certain industries, in which many jobs involved elevated risks of exposure to the coronavirus. In March and April, 4 laws were enacted to address the public health emergency and to directly assist affected households, businesses, and state and local governments. In total, those laws are projected to increase the federal deficit by $2.2 trillion in fiscal year 2020 and by $600 billion next year. In CBO's assessment, the laws will partially mitigate the deterioration in economic conditions and help boost the economy to recovery. Now my colleague Gloria will review CBO's economic projections for 2020 and 2021.
Thanks, Jeff. Early data show that real domestic product fell by 1.2% in the first quarter of 2020, or 4.8% at an annual rate of growth. CBO projects that real GDP will contract even more sharply by 11.2% in the second quarter, almost 38% at an annual rate. In the second quarter, the unemployment rate is projected to average 15%, up from 3.5% just a few months ago, with almost 26 million people either unemployed or having exited the labor force since the end of last year. Overall consumer price inflation is expected to be negative in the second quarter, even though some prices, such as food prices, are expected to rise sharply. The path of the economic recovery after the second quarter depends critically on the path of the virus and the social distancing measures that people, businesses, and communities take in response. By CBO's current assessment, social distancing across the country reached its peak in April 2020, has eased since, and is projected to continue to ease over time. As the pressure from the pandemic and the social distancing lessens, the economy is expected to begin recovering during the second half of this year. The recently enacted laws will contribute to that rebound by boosting consumer demand and by preserving the connections between many employers and their workers so that businesses can ramp up their operations more quickly when public health conditions allow. In CBO's current projections, real GDP grows by an average of 15.8% at an annual rate in the third and fourth quarter of 2020, and by 4.2% on average in 2021. However, recovery of the labor market could be constrained by, among many factors, continued social distancing and the prospect that many businesses may not survive into the second half of 2020. In CBO's current projections, the unemployment rate will rise further in the third quarter this year to a little less than 16%, in part because more people are expected to rejoin the labor force but not to be able to find work immediately. The unemployment rate is expected to decline to about 11.5% by the end of 2020 and to 8.6% by the end of 2021. Because of subdued economic activity and weak labor market conditions through next year, inflation and interest rates on federal borrowing will remain relatively low. Improvements in the economy over the second half of 2020 and through 2021 will not be large enough to make up for earlier losses. Compared with their values in the fourth quarter of 2019, by the fourth quarter of 2021, real GDP is projected to be 1.6% lower, the unemployment rate 5.1 percentage points higher, and the employment to population ratio 4.8 percentage points lower. My colleague John Selesky will review the uncertainty of this outlook and compare the CBO projection to other forecasts.
Thanks, Gloria. An unusually high degree of uncertainty surrounds CBO's latest economic projections. That heightened uncertainty stems from four major factors. The first is how the pandemic will unfold this year and next year. Because this coronavirus is new, important epidemiological characteristics are still being studied. Among those are its transmissibility, the immunity that might be built up by people who have had it, and the lethality of the illness caused by the virus. The second major factor is how the pandemic and social distancing will affect the economy. Many activities might remain at least partially interrupted by concerns about the pandemic and by social distancing. But the extent and nature of those concerns and measures could change over time, and therefore their relation to the economy could change as well. The third major factor is how recent policy actions will affect the economy. Individuals, businesses, and state and local governments could respond more or less to the recent policy interventions by the federal government, resulting in faster or slower economic growth than CBO anticipates. The fourth major factor is how government statisticians will ultimately record economic data when their standard data sources and estimation methods have difficulty accommodating extreme changes. Some data releases might obscure the true underlying trends upon first publication, only to be subject to large revisions in subsequent months or years. In developing its latest economic projections, CBO reviewed private sector forecasts. CBO's projections are broadly similar to the average of about 50 private sector economists, whose forecasts were published in the May 2020 Blue Chip Economic Indicators. CBO's annual projections of real GDP growth, the unemployment rate, and interest rates are within the middle two-thirds of the range of blue chip forecasts for both 2020 and 2021, while projections of GDP price inflation and consumer price inflation are near or within that range. At least part of the variation between CBO's projections and those of other forecasters is attributable to differences in the economic data available when the forecasts were completed, to differences in the economic and statistical models used to prepare them, and to differences in the underlying epidemiological and social distancing projections. In addition, other forecasters may predict that additional pandemic-related legislation will be enacted, whereas CBO's projections incorporate the assumption that current laws generally remain unchanged and that no significant additional emergency funding is provided.
The information we've presented here brings together work by every analyst in CBO's Macroeconomic Analysis Division and by many others around the agency. You can find more information about CBO's economic projections on our website. Thank you for your attention.